We're taught to think of economics as an objective truth. But what if economics isn't neutral at all? What if it's a story, one shaped by power and by a history that has been very carefully edited? A story that celebrates innovation and progress while quietly erasing extraction and exploitation. And most of all, the violence of how wealth was actually built and became concentrated within the countries that dictate systems, policies, laws, and economies globally. A story that presents certain paths forward as universal while making others invisible. And if that's true, if economics is a story, then the question isn't just how economies function, but who they were built for and who they continue to leave behind. Which brings us to the fundamental question that underpins it all. Why are some countries rich while others remain in a cycle of dependency and poverty? Welcome back to Art of Citizenry Podcast, where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, politics, and policy. I'm your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra.
My name is Carolina Alves. I am an associate professor in economics at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, and also a fellow in economics at Girton College, University of Cambridge. Development economics has underpinned my work for over a decade now, shaping how I engage with fair trade, impact measurement and reporting, and sustainable international development law. Across all this work, I've operated at the intersection of globalization, business, and human rights, examining not just how value is created within global supply chains, but how it's narrated, measured, and communicated. Because the stories we tell about impact often shape what we choose to see, how we choose to define growth, development, progress, and what we allow to remain invisible. And so when I came across Carolina and her co-author's book, Decolonizing Economics, an Introduction, I knew this was a conversation I could not turn away from having on this podcast. I work intentionally across different disciplines, such as development studies, political economy, sociology, to try to understand how global financial structures, they are shaped by power relations and long-standing historical legacies that then, of course, will influence macroeconomic outcomes, particularly in my research in developing countries. I examine how fiscal and monetary policy interact with financial globalization and this constant developing of the international monetary financial order. But a key contribution in that context is to understand how developing countries in that context, the pressures, or let's say the conflicting pressures they face, because they're pursuing growth, they're pursuing stability, they want to meet social needs, but they are fundamentally operating within a global financial system that's marked by hierarchy, volatility, unequal power relations. So my research trying to consider that structural constraints at its core, and therefore I challenge the mainstream narratives that present macroeconomics policy as like neutral.
Right in the middle of the Central Plaza in Edinburgh, Scotland, one of the wealthiest cities built on the back of the British Empire, stands a tall statue of Adam Smith. Commonly referred to as the father of economics, his theory of the invisible hand, the idea that free markets in which people participate in their own self-interest or are left to their own devices inadvertently serve the greater social good, has become a cornerstone of modern capitalism. Economics as a discipline was built on a few core assumptions: that people are rational actors, that innovation flourishes when there's incentivization, and that growth is both the goal and the measure of a healthy society. But as we will continue to explore, economics is not a neutral science or a neutral expertise. It is shaped by the histories that have produced the global economy as we know it today. So let's start with the foundations of economics as a discipline. What role have colonial power structures played in the creation of economic theory as we know it today?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a great question. And a difficult one for economics, which shouldn't be, because economics, social sciences, and we know many other social sciences have been discussing the role of colonial power system in their knowledge production. And economics have managed to kind of protect itself. I would say that the reason why this question is so important is because we are in a historical moment where talking about decolonization is becoming mainstream. So it's important to really be clear about what you mean, whether or not the discipline has been, let's say, colonized or has been shaped by colonial power system in the first place. So the question is actually, it wasn't the question I started that discussion, but it's definitely the one that with time it became central. So when you talk about the discipline official, let's say, origins or official history, we always have to think about Adam Smith. That is the father of economics. But it's very interesting to understand that economics as a discipline nowadays is based on a very selective and idealized reading of Adam Smith's work. So what that means? It means that economics took a small part of economic ideas, such as the invisible hand, to build a model where we're talking about markets and human beings being rational, or markets having the self-correcting forces being universal. And in this version, the discussion of capitalism is kind of sidelined, but not only we see capitalism very often as synonymous of market, but capitalism emerged naturally through the process of innovation, of rationality. So the Enlightenment comes in. That's the moment where Adam Smith is writing. But what is really interesting in that narrative is that we really don't make part of the discussion the role of colonialism, imperialism, and transatlantic slave trade. So we have what we call as a very Eurocentric view of history that erases violent extraction, expropriation, and so on. Eurocentrism is a worldview that treats Western Europe's historic experience as the universal, right? As the pathway we all have to follow. It's a narrative that presents capitalism as something that emerged organically, is peaceful, is rational, is the best way you can organize society. And this Eurocentric narrative kind of minimize events that are not peripheral, such as colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, where we could look at the central accumulation of wealth in Europe or the impoverishment of colonialized regions in a very different way, if you consider that the history is much broader than that.
Maybe this is just my understanding, but it seems like in the mainstream consciousness or understanding of economics, capitalism just appears. It appears as innovation, rationality, progress, as a tool of development. But capitalism did not emerge in a vacuum. What's edited out of that narrative are the systems that made that wealth accumulation possible. It accelerated during the era of colonial expansion, stolen land, enslaved labor, theft of land and resources at the global scale, trade routes enforced by gunships, and policies written to benefit the metropole at the expense of the colony. Colonial plunder provided the raw materials, wealth, and slave labor that fueled capital accumulation in Europe. These aren't footnotes in economic history, but rather its foundation. The, quote, free market was truly never free. It was structured to benefit those who held power to set the rules. And yet somewhere along the way, economics positioned itself as a neutral science, objective and universal. Economics, nonetheless, has been purposefully divorced from history. Colonialism, imperialism, and the neo-colonial economic policies that continued to maintain systems of control, from structural adjustment programs to trade liberalization to austerity measures. Econ doesn't exist outside of history. In fact, it shaped the way our global economic system was structured and continues to function. And so when a discipline builds models divorced from historical context, it feels like it is destined to build models that allow for inequality to exist at a global scale. I suppose at a more tangible level, how have you seen the purposeful separation of history from economics further nurture global inequalities?
You're so right to make that point. Now, history has become a little bit more accepted in economics. Not only history, but history of economic thought. We know history is a narrative of power. History is kind of shared with us is told us from the perspective of those who won. So we have to be very careful when you're looking back at history or when you're kind of trying to have a historical approach in our research. Is extremely important, but which kind of history we are really talking about here. Of course, when we separate history from economics, what happens with global inequalities? This is a very pertinent question for our historical moment, not only because, of course, inequality has been increasing, but because inequality also as a topic of study has become more common in economics. Since the publication of Piketty, Capital, the profession has said, oh my gosh, we have to deal with inequality. And I think there's this question of global inequality when you're looking at history from the empirical perspective, but also from the Eurocentric perspective, which you're actually trying to understand the development of capitalism. And the question for you is inequality part of that history?
In 2013, French economist Thomas Piketty published Capital in the 21st Century, which, using data, made the case that inequality isn't a bug of capitalism, it's a feature. His central finding was essentially that when the rate of return on capital constantly outpaces economic growth, which historically it does, wealth concentrates. The rich don't just stay rich, they get richer. They pull further ahead and the gap widens. Piketty's book put inequality back at the center of mainstream economic conversation. But there is a tension there as well. Piketty used data primarily drawn from Western Europe and the United States. He frames inequality within wealthy nations, and what largely goes unexamined is how those wealthy nations got their wealth in the first place. The colonial transfer of resources, the centuries of uncompensated labor, the deliberate underdevelopment of the global South, and I suppose, as I've brought up many times on this podcast and in my work, the global North, global South divide in of itself is laced with colonial power dynamics.
I always say to my students that Piketty, all this amazing work in inequality that comes, now why they're still able to be in top universities in the US? Because they're not challenging the profession at its core. They're not challenging the methodology. They're not challenging the theory. If you're having this approach of history, you're trying to understand the economy embedded in society, right? Which is what actually what the so-called heterodox economists do. You're kind of having this historical process itself is a process of social provisioning, right? It is about the structure of production and reproduction society. So you have to talk about market, about labor, have to talk about distribution, right? So from that perspective, I think when we are discussing the separation of history from economics in terms of how we can, deal with inequality or understand inequality, I would say that we're still far away to have more answers regarding not documenting inequality, but trying to solve this debate. We may never really solve it, which is inequality part of capitalism or not, right?
We tend to treat inequality as a problem that economies can solve. After all, that is the foundational assumption of development economics, an area of research that is premised on the assumption that we can all, quote, grow ourselves out of poverty through capital and trade. What we overlook is that development economics, a model that has underpinned the fair trade movement, impact investing, microfinance, sustainable development goals, structural adjustment programs, foreign aid, etc., is a field that emerged not coincidentally during the decolonization era as European colonial powers were beginning to relinquish formal control over territories. The premise was tidy. Poor countries weren't poor because they had been systematically extracted from. They were poor because they hadn't yet developed. The solution wasn't reparations or redistribution. It was trade. Unequal trade became a colonial continuation, with development economists focused on integration into the very global economic system that had impoverished previously colonized countries in the first place. Now, decolonization as a term gets tossed around a lot. I just used it, and the framework in which I was using it was to define that formal period of time when colonial rule became to dismantle. But it also gets used as an adjective within present-day discourse. How do you define what decolonization means in the context of economics? And maybe more importantly, what is it not?
Decolonization is part of understanding society with all its historical, the positive and the negatives, let's say, and the legacies we still have in it. And economics is one of the main sciences doing this. I am avoiding give you a definition because we realize that is a process more than anything else. One thing that we had agreement, if I can say a little bit on that, is what decolonization is not. So very often when you bring the discussion of decolonization economics, everybody think, oh, we're talking about race and racism, right? It's part of the discussion, but as we discussed before, the Eurocentric discussion when it comes to decolonization of economics make that agenda of decolonizing economics much broader.
Decolonization is not a destination you arrive at. It's a practice, a continuous, often uncomfortable practice of interrogating the systems we have come to accept as standard. Why is GDP the metric we use to define successful economies? It measures output, not well-being. It measures growth, not distribution. The metric itself encodes a set of values, and those values did not emerge from nowhere. And so to me, decolonization of a discipline requires us to ask, who do our current systems serve? Who built them and on whose labor? And most critically, who gets to define what a healthy economy actually looks like? So in your view, what does that process actually entail in practice?
I like to think of myself as a good academic who is not detached from reality. But writing this book, we had the editor really pushing us to have a chapter on, okay, so what are we going to do? And we had all these ideas of what to do, because of course this project also came from our own activism in the discipline. The process of writing the chapter on what needs to be done was much more difficult than what we thought. But one thing that it became very clear for us, and I would start with that, it has to be connected with society, right? We're not doing this just for intellectual exercise. So for us, any discussion of decolonization should be linked with the struggles that are happening in the world, especially in the global south, regarding movements and organizations that are fighting the legacy of colonization every day. I remember being in a panel in the SAS conference, and there was this amazing development economist from the Caribbean. She said to me, decolonization doesn't make sense for academics in the global north universities. For us here, decolonization is every day to be fighting for reparation policies. So this question of how we engage and help these movements and give them platform, help them to review what's going well and what's going wrong, and etc. So this was very key for us as academic and researchers, putting forward this decolonizing agenda, pushing for the researchers really to consider their positionality, being epistemic vigilant to then be able to deal with your own view of the world. What's your starting point? What is your benchmark for you to do your analysis, like what you're thinking, especially when it comes to development, where you want to get it. If the goal is the modernization or mimic or be where developed economies are now, right? What if we see the developing economies not really as unities that still have to catch up, but as more the outcome or the, let's use the economist term, what is the negative externality of capitalism that wasn't part of it or wasn't intentional, but it happens for economies to be what they are. So having a different approach to history or the same history for capitalism, at least put these cards on the table. And if that is the case, what that means when we're, for example, looking at the labor market in the global south.
A negative externality is the cost of an economic activity that isn't borne by the person or entity that created it. Instead, it gets pushed onto a third party who had no say in the transaction. Climate change is a defining example. The countries and corporations that drive the most emissions have borne the least consequences, while the communities that contributed the least are bearing the worst effects. And that gap between who bears the cost and who writes the theory gets to something fundamental about how economics has always chosen its vantage point. Eurocentric understandings of economies have shaped how we define success, how we design development programs, and how we enforce policy across the global economic system.
Over 70% of the labor market is informal, and that's not exception. This is the rule. But then you go there with a theory that is saying that the exception is actually the rule, right? So there's this question of what is your, let's say, the vantage point of your theorization, right? And that has a lot to do with the Eurocentric discussion. And of course, challenge the idea of objectivity, right? This idea of objectivity is always a problem if you want to decolonize a discipline, etc.
So decolonizing economics is about something more foundational than representation. It's about repositioning the vantage point entirely, asking not just who is missing from the data, but whose reality was used to build the model in the first place. Because as you mentioned, over 70% of the global labor market is informal, and traditional frameworks treat that as the exception rather than the rule. It really illustrates in my mind how paternalistic economic policy can be. And so decolonization questions the discipline's foundations, which requires a willingness to challenge things economics has long treated as settled. And at the root of that, in my mind, I suppose the pitfall of development economics is the continuous positioning of, quote, developing countries as subordinate, as countries that are still figuring things out, as opposed to countries that were deliberately prevented from prospering through extraction and control.
Yes. The development economics we have, well, even the field development economics has moved us away from understanding, or at least discussing that aspect. We don't discuss it.
We talk about developing countries as if development is simply a matter of time and better policy, as if some countries are just earlier in the journey with the right institutions, the right investment, the right reforms. Others will get there eventually. Celso Furtado wrote The Myth of Development in 1973 from exile after the coup that ended Brazil's hopeful era of sovereignty-centered development. His argument was essentially that development, as it had been promised to the global South, was never structurally on the table. Not because of corruption, not because of culture or governance failures, but because the global economic system was designed to require some countries to remain in a position of extraction and dependence. Underdevelopment was purposeful. That was 1973. Look at who's pulling lithium out of the ground for the green energy transition today, who provides the raw materials, who captures the value, the patents, the finished products. Look at all of that. And it is really hard for us to argue that he was wrong. You mentioned that a lot of development policies are really created with that notion of dependence at its core. The idea that for a developing country to succeed, they have to in some way be dependent on the global north. And part of that is this assumption that solutions need to match what the global north economy looks like. Can you talk about what happens when those policies meet communities where that model just doesn't fit?
You're so right. We discussed that as well in the book in different examples, different contexts, which is the idea, even the universal principles, the self-interest. There is this relationship between the scholarship and policy that influence our policy, especially IMF and World Bank and etc. So the type of policies that go to developing countries with how they can achieve development, what they need to do. And for one example, we always discuss is the private property idea. And the property rights, right? And then you have countries where the idea of sharing collective land, like this is what is at the core. You can't go there and divide the land and thinking that things will work. And IMF experiments along these lines, actually, it didn't end up well. In our research, we really focus on the self-interest as one part of this neutral Eurocentric principle, right? That economic has at its core. and how in other parts of the world actually altruism is at the core of relationships. And of course, the main example was the Ubuntu culture, the South African kind of approach, where the idea of self-interest, maximizing utility, is impossible for their mindset because the altruism is there. But then you have the policy levels, the kind of policy to promote prosperity, development that will focus or would have in its background, because nothing is neutral. They may say, oh, this is empirical, this is just policy. But what's guiding the theory that's influencing and guiding this principle is coming from the foundation is based on the self-interest, so property rights, as you said, or rationality.
Eurocentric frameworks of growth and prosperity tend to center the individual. That goes all the way back to Adam Smith, the assumption that economies function best when individuals pursue their own self-interest. But for much of the world, that premise doesn't reflect how economies have actually been organized. Communal models of production, land stewardship, systems of reciprocity and redistribution that allowed for communal prosperity predate anything Western economies would recognize as formal. These were functioning economies rooted in communal cultures as opposed to individualistic ones. I feel like the Green Revolution in Punjab is a useful example of what happens when that gets ignored. So in the 1960s, the United States promoted high-yield crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, and industrial farming techniques across the global South as a development intervention. It was framed as modernization, but it was also a Cold War strategy. The Green Revolution was an explicit effort to raise agricultural output, with the thought that it would reduce poverty and in turn blunt the appeal of land reform movements. The logic was that if yields go up, the argument for redistributing land goes away. What it disrupted was a farming culture built on communal land use, shared labor, and locally adapted agricultural knowledge accumulated over generations. Industrial monoculture replaced it. While more productive by the metric development economists were measuring, it was deeply destabilizing by nearly every other metric. Soil degradation, water depletion, rise in cancer rates, insurmountable farmer debt, which then led to an uptake in farmer suicides and the erosion of community economic structures that has sustained people for centuries. The Green Revolution produced yields, but it also produced dependence on seeds, chemicals, companies such as Monsanto, global commodity markets, etc. And that pattern of costs externalized onto communities, of models that treat local economic logic as an obstacle to be overcome, shows up far beyond agriculture. When the IMF attaches conditions to financing that require dismantling collective land ownership, when development policy is built on models that treat individual self-interest as universal, when the benchmark for good institutions is always a Western one, the gap between the model and the reality it's supposed to describe doesn't just produce bad economics, it produces bad outcomes for communities that already carry the weight of a long history of extraction. Which brings us to growth, because if there's one concept that sits at the center of this entire framework, the one that modern capitalism most depends on and most rarely interrogates, it's growth. Specifically, this idea that economies must expand continuously, that profit maximization is not a choice but a logic, and that more output is always, by definition, better than less. So how does colonial logic continue to shape the way we think about growth and frankly define when enough is enough?
Wow, the growth question. I think, quite honestly, even within this heterodoxy, or let's say this different way of thinking about development, we still have what we call this teleological view of economic growth and development. It's like we all heading to that point. Like history becomes like how we remove obstacles to this progress so that we have with capitalism. And I think even in heterodoxy, in many authors from the global south, you see that attachment to economic growth as the way to, after that we think about it. After that we see where we go, but we need to industrialize, we need the structural transformation, we need to get growth, then we see what happens. And I think this is difficult to curtail the creativity of what is a society that is not really thinking in terms of progress, thinking in terms of prosperity, that the goal is not economic growth, right? So I think this in itself is a big problem. I can't really tell you, to the best of my knowledge, that in economics we have a different thinking that is linked to progress that doesn't involve economic growth. So there is this question when you think about economic growth within capitalism: can everyone grow at the same time? You think in terms of nation, can everyone achieve that? And you think in terms of the global division of labor, imports, exports. I honestly can't see that's possible. Like countries suffered a process of deindustrialization. The case of Brazil is super telling. They went back to actually be powerhouse in terms of exporting commodities like copper, corn, so which we know has a very low aggregate value, and therefore it becomes more difficult to achieve this economic growth that then can be shared with everyone. Even if we thought, okay, we can do growth, it can be green, and all nations can do that. Then there is the issue of distribution within countries, right? Which has to do with the share of labor and capital. And as we know, the share of labor has been declining since the neoliberal era started. So there's also this question of, again, within capitalism, how we distributed wealth is not very clear to me if that is possible to do without this constant tension between labor and capital that you have seen throughout history.
And that tension between who produces the wealth and who captures it goes to the heart of one of capitalism's most durable stories, that the system, whatever its flaws, has delivered. Rising living standards, falling poverty rates, longer life expectancy. But that story also depends enormously on where you start the measurement and whose experience you center when you're counting.
We like to talk about progress. We like to talk that we've never had it better. Capitalism is the system that really gave us everything. But who has been having access to that is interesting. So even the question of what's happening to, because there's the difference in poverty and, of course, income inequality, right? So we can say that capitalism helped in terms of poverty, but the levels of inequality, since the neoliberalism onwards, is something really telling. When workers in developed economies were really achieving some more levels of stability and labor rights and so on, we are having then the workers in the global south actually not having access to that. Quite the opposite. The entire discussion of subcontracting and etc. What's happening is you go after workers around the globe. So even that kind of wage relationship, so it's not just about the labor share between capital and labor, in a more abstract terms. It's within that kind of colonial system, even within the workers, we're going to have also this difference in the racial hierarchy in terms of the type of workers as well that do not have access to labor rights within developed economies and developing economies as well, right? So all this can be better understood if you consider a history of capitalism that is linked. Transatlantic slave trade is linked to colonialism, right? And then you can address this question of economic growth in different ways.
As workers in the global north won protections such as the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, occupational safety standards, corporations began looking elsewhere. As labor got more expensive domestically, and of course, compromising on profits was never part of the profit maximization equation, corporations began looking where they could get cheap labor. Globalization didn't just move production, quote, offshore, it moved production strategically to places where labor standards and environmental regulations were weaker, where unions could be suppressed, where governments are dependent on foreign investment and can't afford to say no. Distance became a business model, and the supply chain became the mechanism through which corporations could benefit from exploitation, may it be child labor or trafficked labor, without being legally accountable for it. What happens 3 tiers down in a factory in some country far away with weak labor protections is structured to be invisible. And of course, we have seen some cases over recent years that have begun piercing that corporate veil of protection within global supply chains, but those are still far few. The transatlantic slave trade produced a logic about whose labor has value and whose labor can be extracted at the lowest possible cost. That logic didn't disappear. Globalization restructured it into every supply chain designed to ensure that the people doing the hardest work in the most dangerous conditions capture the least value from what they produce. Economics has always been a choice about what we measure, what we value, whose reality is centered, and whose is treated as peripheral. The choice was never neutral, and recognizing that is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a more honest one. The work of interrogating deeply embedded systems is already underway. It's happening in how a new generation of economists are refusing to separate history from their models, in the movements across the global South fighting for land rights, debt cancellations, and reparations, in the communities that never abandoned economic systems rooted in reciprocity and collective stewardship. The question is whether the discipline is willing to follow their lead. What that requires, more than anything, is epistemic humility. The willingness to sit with the possibility that the model is wrong, that the benchmark is wrong, that how we define growth and prosperity might actually need to be reimagined. Thank you to Carolina Alves for her time. Her book is called Decolonizing Economics. I'll link to it in the show notes along with everything else we've referenced today. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. If this conversation was useful to you, please consider contributing at artofcitizenry.com/support. Subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and of course, please share these conversations forward. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.